It was around 5:45 in the evening when the hijacked 727 finally rolled to a stop about a half a mile away from the SeaTac terminal. Following nearly 3 hours of constant motion, coupled with the droning hum of the 3 large turbines, the sudden stillness and quiet in the cabin was unnerving. The chiming of the interphone broke the silence.
Yes, sir.
Hey, Tina. Let this guy know that the stairs truck and the fuel truck are about to pull up.
Sir, that's the captain there. He says that the stairs truck and the refueling truck are about to hook up to the plane.
That's good. You going up ahead. And hey, I want you to bring the money on board first, all right? And while you're up there, I'll be heading to the laboratory for a few minutes. Go on.
For the first time in hours, she was not only freed from his presence, but was able to leave the confines of the rear of the plane. She marched briskly up the aisle, past the still-seated passengers, opened the forward exit, and then walked down the stairs onto the wet runway. Parked about 20 yards away was a small sedan with its headlights on. A man standing by the passenger door waved at her to approach.
Hey there. You holding up all right?
I'm fine. He says he wants the money first.
Well, here you go. It's $200,000. Pretty heavy.
Goodness, it sure is.
Her arms were immediately filled with a canvas bank bag weighing north of 20 pounds. The stares of a few dozen passengers greeted her as she returned to the aircraft. None of the passengers were talking. The cabin was completely quiet except for the sound of Tina's boots. The heavy bag had Seattle First National Bank stenciled in large letters across the front. It was awkward to carry, and she struggled to keep it in her arms. When her strength finally gave out, she set it on the floor and dragged it the rest of the way toward the hijacker, who had now returned from the lavatory and was watching her intently as she approached. She hoisted the bag onto seat 18D, her place of imprisonment for the previous 3 hours. He looked at it and then glanced up at Tina.
Hey, don't you remember I said I wanted the money in a knapsack? Where's the knapsack?
She didn't respond, and he refocused his attention back on the bag, briefly rifling through it. Sensing that he was satisfied, she took a gamble and asked,
Hey, so now that you have your money, do you think that you could let the passengers go? I mean, you still have the crew. We're not going anywhere.
Although the hijacker originally said he would only release the passengers once all of his demands were met, he thought about it for a few seconds and then suddenly agreed with her.
Yeah, sure, that's fine. They can go.
She called the cockpit without hesitation, and to the immense relief of the passengers, an announcement was made over the intercom that they were free to leave. Tina still wanted to maintain the illusion that nothing was amiss, so she bade the passengers a happy Thanksgiving as she steered them toward the front exit and down the stairs.
Happy Thanksgiving. Bye-bye.
Now that the passengers had successfully deplaned, Tina headed back toward her captor, who was still seated calmly in the last row. Suddenly, a passenger ran back onto the plane claiming to have forgotten his briefcase. She felt a momentary panic, imagining the hijacker might perceive this as a member of law enforcement rushing the plane to take him out. Moving fast, she quickly retrieved the passenger's briefcase and hustled him back off the plane. She looked nervously back toward the hijacker, but he seemed unmoved by the whole incident. In the cockpit, Radicek was perturbed by the commotion and wanted to ensure that there was not a repeat. He immediately got on the radio with Al Lee, who was still waiting on Tina to come back for the parachutes.
Al, please go stand by the bottom of the stairs and secure that area. We just had a passenger come back up the stairs because he forgot a bag. We just had to literally push him back off the steps. Roger that.
Tina returned to the hijacker, feeling more relaxed now that the passengers were no longer in danger. She pointed at the bag and attempted to bring some levity to her situation.
Gosh, there is a lot of money in that bag. Can I have some?
Sure. Here, you can have this.
To her surprise, the hijacker removed a packet of cash from the bag and shoved it in her hand. The paper bank strap on the packet said it was $2,000, about 4 months of salary for the young stewardess. She quickly handed it back to him, explaining that they weren't allowed to accept gratuities.
Oh, gosh, well, I do appreciate that, but we're not actually allowed to accept gratuities on the airline, sir.
Oh, All right. Suit yourself. Hey, I think you're forgetting my parachutes are still out there.
Oh, right, yes. Sorry. How heavy are they? Do I need one of the other girls to help me out?
Oh, they're not that heavy. You can manage it yourself.
When she returned with the first backpack and handed it to him, he asked her to close all the window shades in the tourist section. Following the delivery of the second backpack, the hijacker suddenly stopped her, apparently flustered about something. He looked up at the exhausted stewardess.
Hey, there's no D-rings on these backpacks. They should know any D-rings.
She didn't understand what he meant and chose not to ask, but he seemed to drop the issue, so she returned up the aisle to retrieve the 2 front chutes. Retrieving the parachutes took 3 trips. Each of the larger backpacks required her full strength to haul aboard. The 2 front packs were much lighter and smaller, though, and she was able to carry both of them in a single trip. With the 4 parachutes now laid across various seats in the rear of the aircraft, Tina sat down and watched the man inspect each of them. She had taken up temporary residence across the aisle from him in seat 18C. While he rummaged through the large backpacks, she curiously noted that he removed and read small paper cards hidden inside pockets within the packs. He then began to complain yet again about the money being delivered in a bank bag and not in the knapsack that he had requested.
You know, I really needed that knapsack. The other one wrote that down in the note, didn't she? I mean, I did say knapsack. They should know that.
Speaking his thoughts out loud, he muttered that he'd need to find a way to pack the money more securely.
I don't know what I'm supposed to do with this money bag here. The money's going to fly everywhere when I leave. So I wrap it up somehow, tie it together. Ridiculous.
She watched as he popped one of the small parachutes, produced a pocket knife, and cut away the shroud lines that connected the canopy to the parachute container. He first tried to stuff the money bag inside this now empty parachute container, but it was much too large to fit.
That's not going to work.
He abandoned that idea and instead took the long lines he had just cut and used them to wrap the bag over and around several times. As he did so, he announced to Tina that he had some new demands for her to convey. Though he had previously been evasive when pressed about his ultimate destination, he was now ready to enact this next phase of his heist. She grabbed a pay sheet and wrote down his latest demands.
We're going to Mexico City or any place in Mexico nonstop. Gear down, flaps at 15. Don't go over 10,000 feet. All the cabin lights need to be out. Don't land again in the States for fuel or any other reason. Nobody behind the first class section.
She immediately sprang up and relayed this information to the cockpit over the interphone. Before she could finish, the hijacker turned to her with yet another demand.
And hey, something else. I want this bulkhead door open at takeoff, and I want the stairs lowered after we're up. Oh, and also that the stewardesses can leave before we take off.
As the flight crew in the cockpit listened to these demands, they knew they were in trouble.
Well, that explains the parachutes, doesn't it? Can we even do that? Fly with the stairs down? We need to contact Paul. He'll probably know.
Could a 727 even fly with the aft stairs down? They didn't think so. What about flying dirty with the flaps down and gear down? Don't go over 10,000 feet? Radicek wondered aloud where this guy had come up with all this stuff.
We're going to have to go unpressurized, and of course he wants the rear down for some reason, and he wants the flaps down to 15, I think. He seems to know a little bit about an airplane.
Flying with the stairs down meant that the aircraft couldn't be pressurized. Without pressurization, there would be no oxygen circulating, and once they flew above 10,000 feet, the oxygen would begin to get dangerously thin. Thankfully for Radicek and the rest of the crew, one of the men listening back at Northwest headquarters in Minneapolis was legendary pilot Paul Soderlund. A bona fide aviation wizard, Soderlund was at the time working for Northwest as their director of flight operations. He had been in constant contact with the crew since the start of the hijacking, but now that the hijacker started demanding such bizarre flight configurations, his expertise truly was about to come in handy. Hearing the demands, Soderlund's first thoughts were about fuel consumption. Right away, he knew that flying with the gear down, flaps extended, and with the stairs lowered was going to severely limit the range of the aircraft.
305, even with full tanks, you can't make it all the way to Mexico City. Flying in that configuration, you can't even make it to the Mexican border.
It was around 6:30 when Radicek called back to Tina to give the hijacker the news that they would need to land for a refueling stop in order to make Mexico.
Yes, sir.
Tell him that we won't be able to make it all the way to Mexico on a single tank of gas with the way he's asking us to fly. We can do refueling stops, though. Ask him about San Francisco, Los Angeles, or San Diego.
Sir, I'm sorry, but they're saying that if we fly the way that you want them to fly, we can't make it all the way to Mexico without stopping to refuel. They're saying we can stop to refuel in San Francisco, Los Angeles, or San Diego.
No, all those places are way too busy. What about Phoenix?
He says those places are all too busy. He's asking about Phoenix.
Phoenix, yes, he wants Phoenix. We can hear him pretty well through the interphone. We'll talk to the company and get back with him.
In the midst of this exchange between the hijacker and the pilots, Tina was joined in the rear by her fellow stewardesses, Schaffner and Hancock. They asked where he was taking them, but he gave no response, prompting Hancock to simply ask if they could leave. Tina tried to elicit some sympathy from the hijacker in hopes that he would consent to their departure. She explained to him that Hancock was a newlywed and that she had Thanksgiving plans in Seattle with her husband, a pilot from Northwest. He thought about it briefly and looked up at them from behind his sunglasses.
Sure, you girls can do whatever you'd like.
Thank you, sir.
Thank you.
Oh, hey, wait, hold on. Here.
He dug around in his pockets and pulled out some loose cash that he held in their direction. They refused to accept it. Yet again, the hijacker had to hear about Northwest policy prohibiting stewardesses from accepting gratuities. Schaffner and Hancock looked back at Tina and waited for her to follow. Her instinct told her to hang up the interphone immediately and flee this wretched situation as quickly as she could. Yet the hijacker and the flight crew were still in the midst of negotiating the location of the refueling stop, and she knew her role as intermediary was a critical one.
You two can go on. I'll be right behind you. I just need to finish this call.
However, her hopes for freedom were short-lived as the hijacker quickly pointed his finger at her.
Not you, miss. You're gonna have to stay with me. I gotta have your help to lower these stairs once we're up in the air again.
She now knew this nightmare wasn't going to end anytime soon. Looking up the aisle, she saw the other two girls hesitate by the front exit and look back at her. But moments later, they were gone. She later explained,
I think at that time, the one feeling I had that was in the forefront of my mind was that I just felt so alone.
In the cockpit, the crew were simultaneously communicating with multiple individuals about a variety of topics. Information was flying back and forth about how far the aircraft could fly before they needed to refuel, where the refueling stop would be, how they were going to get there, and also whether it was even possible to fly with the stairs lowered, as the hijacker was demanding. It was now 7 o'clock, and they'd been on the ground for around 80 minutes. Throughout much of that time, Tina had deftly engaged the interphone's open channel button as she held it in her hands. This allowed the cockpit to eavesdrop on whatever the hijacker was saying to Tina and also to gauge what his mood was at any given moment. The crew could take preventative steps to appease the man if they sensed a shift in his attitude about a particular complication. Thus far, the setbacks the hijacker encountered had caused him some angst and frustration, but he had shrugged them off without too much complaint. He hadn't been pleased when his money arrived without his requested knapsack, and was also displeased when he learned they'd have to make a refueling stop. But once he realized they had been on the ground for an hour and the aircraft still wasn't fully refueled, he became furious. Drama with the refueling process began shortly after landing in Seattle. One of the hijacker's original demands was for a fuel truck to begin refueling the aircraft immediately upon landing. In compliance with this demand, a fuel truck had been waiting for Flight 305 as it pulled to a halt and was the first vehicle allowed to approach the aircraft. As the flight engineer, Harold Anderson had been monitoring the fuel coming onto the plane when he noticed their fuel gauge stop rising. The needle had barely moved past empty. He curiously reported to the pilots that they've stopped taking on fuel. Thankfully, the fuel truck operators had been equipped with portable radios, allowing the flight crew to communicate with them directly. Radicek called down to them over the radio.
Hey, what's going on down there? We're not not getting any fuel out of that truck.
The refuelers responded that they had a vapor lock in the lines. Though the 727 required 50,000 pounds of fuel to be fully refueled, this truck had only managed to put 3,000 pounds aboard before getting locked up. Agitated, the crew called for a second fuel truck to come up and, as a safety measure, requested a third truck to be on standby. Back in row 18, the hijacker was growing anxious, and Tina was becoming concerned. As soon as he heard of the mishap with the fuel truck, he exploded.
They are stalling me!
But his outburst wouldn't last for long, as Tina quickly pointed out that a second fuel truck was on its way. Yet again, she had succeeded in tempering the man's rising emotions, and he quickly returned to his ongoing efforts to secure the money bag with the shroud lines he had cut. Though he was no longer shouting, he was still growing more anxious as the minutes went by. Tina certainly understood why he was frustrated, as every extra minute that they spent on the ground gave law enforcement more time to foil his heist. During those tense moments, Tina kept the interphone line open, and the crew heard every word.
I did know those people out there are stalling. They're up to something. To tie this bag together. This is why I wanted a knapsack. These parachutes and no D-rings. I don't know what's going on out there, but these people need to hurry up. It's time to go.
If they wanted to prevent a repeat of his previous outburst, they desperately needed that second fuel truck to arrive.
Fellas, he's getting awfully antsy back there, so let's try to hustle this up, okay?
Incredibly, it took almost an hour for the second and third fuel trucks to arrive. Contributing to their delay was the unusual location of Flight 305, as fuel trucks were not accustomed to refueling so far from the terminal. This led to considerable confusion among the drivers when they received their instructions. Once they were eventually headed in the right direction, Radicek made sure to remind them to turn off their flashing lights, lest they spook the hijacker. The second fuel truck finally pulled up around 6:50 and began the refueling process. Anderson was nervously monitoring the fuel gauge on his instrument panel and felt relief as the needle began to rise at its usual rate. But his relief wouldn't last. Minutes later, Anderson found himself experiencing deja vu.
Captain, they've stopped fueling again. We're not getting anything on.
Yet again, Radicek called down to the fuel truck, but this time he had lost his typically cool temperament.
Hey, down in the fuel truck. Just what in the holy hell is going on down there?
They responded that the fuel nozzle had frozen up on them. Radicek was in total disbelief. He wondered how anything could have frozen when it wasn't even freezing outside to begin with. Plus, he knew that jet fuel has a freeze point of negative 40 degrees Fahrenheit. Something about this frozen fuel nozzle story just didn't smell right to him. Their fuel gauge indicated that they only had 26,000 pounds aboard, just half of what they needed to be fully refueled. That third fuel truck was going to be needed quickly, and Scott radioed for it to come at once. The veteran captain also went ahead and ordered a fourth fuel truck to be brought up, just in case. The hijacker had either seen or heard the second fuel truck moving away, and assumed the refueling process was now complete. He asked Tina to get confirmation from the cockpit. When she called, Radicek delicately walked her through the issue with the frozen nozzle. He knew perfectly well that the hijacker was not going to respond favorably to this excuse. Nervously, Tina looked over at the man as he awaited her response. He was staring blankly at her from behind his dark sunglasses. The ill news that she delivered sent the man into a fit, and he ranted that this was an obvious stalling tactic. He screamed that a frozen fuel nozzle was impossible in Seattle, and then threatened to blow the plane up. Tina held her breath, as did the cockpit crew, who heard his rant through the interphone. Thankfully, the swift arrival of the third fuel truck put an end to his rantings, and he shifted his focus elsewhere. As Tina continued decompressing from the shock of the hijacker's latest outburst, she watched as he stood in the aisle and wrapped one of the lengthy shroud lines around his waist several times. Tied to the other end of the line was the money bag, itself wrapped over and around numerous times by those shroud lines. Tina estimated that this tether between the hijacker's waist and the money bag was about 6 feet long, so when the hijacker moved around, the bag dragged on the floor behind him. Tina also watched as he put on the green backpack. She was impressed by how quickly he snapped the buckles and adjusted the various straps. Though her experience with parachutes and skydivers was virtually nil, it still appeared to her that he had put on a parachute many times before. To Tina's surprise, Florence Schaffner had come back on board and was walking down the aisle in her direction. Equally surprising was that Schaffner was not coming to speak to her, but to the hijacker. She had left her purse in the back and was asking permission to get it. After the hijacker gave his consent, Tina watched Schaffner hurriedly scoot past him and retrieve her purse from the compartment where the oxygen bottles were kept. As quickly as she had come aboard, Schaffner was back off again, and Tina was once more alone with the hijacker. Up front, Anderson stared at the instrument panel and shook his head in disbelief.
Hey, Captain, you're not gonna believe this.
Yet another issue had developed with the fuel truck. This third fuel truck had only managed to pump a paltry 300 pounds of fuel into the jet before it ran dry. Thus far, there had been a vapor lock on the fuel lines of the first truck, a frozen nozzle on the second truck, and now this third truck was virtually empty from the start. This was all too much for Captain Scott, and he began to believe that somebody out there was playing games with them, which was a clear violation of the agreement they made with law enforcement to stand down. The normally taciturn Scott finally spoke up and announced to anyone listening over the radio.
If you folks out there are trying to delay us with these sort of tactics, then you need to get with it and get this fuel on board. And get over here and start pumping gas.
To everyone's relief, the fourth fuel truck had no issues, and in less than 15 minutes they were fully refueled. Perhaps just as fortuitous was the fact that the hijacker was too preoccupied donning his parachute to realize that the third fuel truck had been swapped out for a fourth truck. The next time Tina called the cockpit for a status update, they were able to confirm that the refueling efforts were now complete. Paul Soderlund was back on the radio from Minneapolis. He had finally worked out the range limitations for their refueling stop. Half an hour earlier, the hijacker asked if Phoenix was possible, but Soderlund had since concluded that it was doubtful the aircraft could reach Phoenix without running out of gas. Soderlund then suggested Reno. Without any hesitation, the hijacker readily agreed to Reno as their next destination. Discussion soon shifted toward what route they were going to follow to get to Reno. Being unable to travel above 10,000 feet was going to put them in danger of slamming into one of the numerous mountain peaks of the Cascades that exceeded that elevation. Then once they moved into California, they'd also have to contend with the Sierra Nevada mountains and all of its tall peaks. Radicek had a suggestion that he hoped would not only free themselves from the hijacker, but would also free humanity from his existence altogether. He requested that they be given a southerly route out of Seattle that would put them heading south along the coast before they doglegged east toward Reno. His hope for such a route was that the hijacker might not realize they were over the Pacific Ocean and would simply bail out and drown. Radicek's fantasy was not to be, as Soderlund determined that the safest route out of Seattle without exceeding 10,000 feet would be to follow the Victor 23 airway. It was now 7:15, and with their flight path secured and the fuel tanks topped off, there was still one final issue that needed to be resolved. For the past hour, the elephant in the room had been the hijacker's demand that they fly with the aft stairs lowered. Back when they first heard this demand, the pilots questioned whether flying in such a configuration was even possible. Their answer would come from Soderlund, who had called Boeing soon after hearing the hijacker's demand. He reported back to the crew that it was, in fact, perfectly safe to fly with the stairs lowered.
305, you shouldn't have any control problems when the stairs are extended, except it may pitch up a bit slightly.
But the hijacker's insistence that Tina remain back there to help him lower the stairs was troubling for the flight crew. Eager for a solution that would allow her to leave before takeoff, the crew first offered to simply teach the hijacker how to lower the stairs himself, but he had no interest in their offer. They then tried to appease him by offering to have the stairs partially lowered at takeoff. This proposal wasn't rejected by the hijacker, but by Soderlund, who was listening in and spoke up that there was no intermediate position for the aft stairs.
No, fellas, there is no intermediate setting on the aft stairs. You can't partially lower them. They're either up or down, open or closed. That's it.
The stairs were lowered by gravity on the 727-100, meaning that they only had two positions, closed and open. To Radicek's surprise, the hijacker then offered up his own solution, which, ostensibly, would have made Tina's continued presence as a hostage unnecessary. This would be a win-win if practical. The hijacker proposed that the stairs be fully lowered and locked before takeoff. From the hijacker's perspective, such an arrangement would ensure that the aircraft wasn't going to become an aluminum jail cell if the stairs failed to lower in flight. Yet again, it was Soderlund who nixed the idea, telling the crew,
305, it's impossible to take off like that with the stairs down. With those down, you won't be able to rotate the aircraft.
In other words, if they took off with the stairs down, the stairs would be crushed against the runway when the butt of the aircraft went down as the nose rose up. Back in row 18, Tina was off in her thoughts somewhere when Radicek's voice brought her back into the moment.
Tina, you gotta tell him flat out that if he wants to go beyond here, the stairs have to be up when we take off. No discussion. We can't do it.
She was leery of communicating more ill news to the man at that point. The aircraft had been on the ground for over an hour, and his nerves were beginning to get more frayed with each passing minute. Yet to Tina's surprise, when she advised the hijacker that the crew was refusing to take off with the stairs down, he didn't argue the point or even appear upset.
Yeah, they could take off like that if they wanted to, but that's all right. We can lower them once we're up.
For the flight crew, their efforts to get Tina away from the situation had failed. As a result, they shifted their focus toward figuring out a way to keep her safe back there when it came time to lower the stairs. Despite the hijacker's demand that the plane fly depressurized, the crew still remained concerned that she might be sucked out once she opened the stairs. Even if she wasn't sucked out, they also considered the possibility that she might lose her balance, bounce down the stairs, and simply fall out of the aircraft entirely.
Okay, Tina, here's what I want you to do. We have escape ropes that are in the overhead compartments up here. We want to cut a piece of that rope off and bring it to you. Then I want you to put pillows around your stomach, tie that rope around the pillows, and tie the end of that rope around one of the legs of the seats. We'll send Andy back with the rope.
Hearing this, the hijacker shouted.
Hey, absolutely not. Nobody is coming back here.
He also refused to let her go to the cockpit to get the rope herself. But Tina was afraid and continued to express to the hijacker her fears of being sucked out. He finally placated her by claiming that when the time came, he would ensure her safety by tying her to the seat using one of the shroud lines he had been working with. The cockpit received another call from Tina. The hijacker was getting worked up again at the delay. He was demanding to know why they hadn't left yet. The crew answered that they still needed to file a flight plan and receive an IFR clearance from the tower before they could take off. The hijacker heard this and said,
No, that's another stalling tactic. They're just stalling again. They can do all of that over the radio once we're up. Now come on, let's get this show on the road.
Though the flight crew weren't intentionally stalling, the hijacker had indeed been correct about them being able to pick up their clearances in the air. So with that, they decided it was time to go ahead and crank up the engines. Radicek radioed down to Al Lee.
Al, we're all set here, so you can head on back if you'd like. We appreciate your assistance with this thing. We're gonna get her cranked up now and pick up our clearance in the air. Thank you again.
Roger that. Good luck, you guys.
It was 7:27 p.m., and the aircraft was finally moving again as they taxied for takeoff. They had been on the ground in Seattle for just short of 2 hours. Known for his brevity, Captain Scott lived up to his reputation as he issued a final goodbye to everyone at SeaTac.
Well, I guess we'll be going now. Sorry for the trouble. That's quite all right, Captain. It was no problem.
What happened next would transform this unique hijacking into one of the most infamous crimes in world history. Within the next hour, the anonymous hijacker would vanish into the darkness and be reborn as the legendary D.B. Cooper.